The heavy steel padlock on my workshop door was new. It was a solid brass master lock, the kind that cost $50 at the hardware store, and it had been installed sometime between my departure at midnight and my return at 6 in the morning. I stood in the freezing dampness of the Ohio morning, staring at the brass reflecting the pale dawn light, my breath pluming in the air. I didn't need to guess who had put it there. The property technically belonged to my grandmother's estate, and the estate was currently being managed by my older brother, Elias. I pulled my phone from my jacket. There were 14 missed calls, most of them from cousins and aunts who hadn't spoken to me in 5 years. The single text message, however, was from Elias. It read, "We know about the withdrawals, Marcus. We are locking the assets until you agree to mediation. Don't make this a police matter. For the last 3 months, ever since our grandmother Eleanor passed away, a strange silence had settled over the Davis family. I had assumed it was grief. Eleanor had been the anchor of our chaotic family, the one who hosted the Sunday dinners, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and, crucially, the one who held the deed to the 6 acres of commercial property on the edge of town where I ran my metal restoration business. I had spent the last 8 years quietly rebuilding my life in that corrugated steel shed. In my 20s, I had been a wreck, buried in gambling debts, unreliable, toxic. Elias had been the golden child, the one who took over our father's logistics company, the one who wore suits to Tuesday lunches, the one who paid for my rehab. I had spent nearly a decade earning back a fraction of my grandmother's trust, working 12-hour days, paying rent for my shop directly into her account, and keeping my head down. Now, staring at the padlock, I realized the silence hadn't been grief. It had been an investigation, or rather, a witch hunt. I didn't break the lock. Instead, I drove to the local diner, ordered black coffee, and opened my laptop. I logged into my personal checking account. Nothing was frozen there. Then I checked the joint operating account I used for purchasing steel and vintage auto parts. The balance was 0. A hold had been placed on the funds. When I called the automated bank line, a recorded voice informed me that a fraud alert had been triggered by an authorized signatory, Elias. He had insisted on being a co-signer on my business account years ago as a condition for co-signing my initial equipment loan. I had paid the loan off 3 years ago, but I had never removed his name. It was an oversight born of complacency. At 9 o'clock, I walked into the local branch of the credit union. The lobby smelled of lemon floor cleaner and old paper. I asked to speak with Rebecca, the branch manager. I had known her for years. She was the one who had helped me set up my business accounts when my credit score was still in the low 500s. She looked deeply uncomfortable when I sat across from her desk. I asked her why my business account was frozen. Rebecca carefully steepled her fingers, her eyes darting to the closed blinds of her office window. She explained that Elias had presented the bank with an executor's affidavit regarding Eleanor's estate. He had filed a formal claim stating that funds missing from Eleanor's primary savings account had been systematically funneled into my business account over the past 14 months. Because his name was still attached to my LLC's banking profile, he had the authority to freeze the assets pending an audit. I asked how much money was missing. Rebecca hesitated, citing privacy protocols regarding the deceased's accounts, but the look on my face must have conveyed a genuine, terrifying ignorance. She quietly wrote a number on a sticky note and pushed it across the desk. It was nearly $300,000. I stared at the blue ink. That was the entirety of Eleanor's liquid life savings. It was the money meant to pay off the mortgages of my 2 younger cousins, the money meant to keep the property taxes paid on the land where my shop sat. I told Rebecca, keeping my voice dangerously level, that I hadn't taken a dime. I paid rent, I bought my own groceries. I had barely scraped by last winter because I refused to ask Eleanor for a loan when my air compressor died. Rebecca pulled the sticky note back and dropped it into the shredder beneath her desk. She told me she couldn't show me Eleanor's statements without a court order, but she suggested with a very deliberate tone that I look closely at the cancelled rent checks I had written to my grandmother over the last 2 years. I left the bank feeling as though the ground had turned to ash. I drove back to my rented duplex, a cramped 1-bedroom across town. I dug a cardboard box out of my closet. I am a meticulous record keeper. It's a survival mechanism from my days of being drowning in debt. I need to know where every single cent goes, so I never slide back. I pulled out the file containing the carbon copies of every rent check I had handed to Eleanor. Eleanor was old-fashioned. She didn't do electronic transfers. I wrote her a physical check for $800 on the first of every month. I pulled up my online banking portal and started looking at the scanned images of the deposited checks. For the first 6 years, the endorsement on the back was always Eleanor's shaky, looping cursive. But 14 months ago, the signature changed. It was a stamp. For deposit only, account ending in 4402. I didn't recognize that account number. Eleanor's primary checking, the one I had occasionally helped her balance when her eyesight started failing, ended in 9118. I pulled up the State Business Registry website. I typed in the address of my brother's logistics firm. Then I started pulling the public UCC filings, the records of commercial liens and loans. It took me 4 hours to find it. 14 months ago, Davis Logistics had been hit with a massive federal tax lien. 2 weeks later, a new line of credit had been opened by Elias's company, secured by a cash collateral account, an account that, according to the public filing, was held at the very same credit union. The pieces began to snap together, sharp and jagged. Elias hadn't just accused me to cover his tracks. He had orchestrated this entirely. He had been quietly bleeding Eleanor's savings to prop up his failing logistics company. And when she died, he knew the empty accounts would be discovered during probate. He needed a scapegoat. Who better than the former addict brother? The family would believe it instantly. They already wanted to believe it. It confirmed everything they had always thought about me. My phone buzzed. It was my cousin Isaac. He asked if we could meet at a neutral location. We agreed on a diner out on the highway. When I arrived, Isaac looked exhausted. He slid a thick manila envelope across the Formica table. He told me the family was having a meeting tomorrow evening at Elias's house to discuss pressing criminal charges. Isaac said Elias was offering a deal if I signed over my legal right to the shop property and permanently surrendered my share of the estate. Elias would convince the family not to go to the police. I asked Isaac if he actually believed I took the money. Isaac looked at his coffee mug. He said it didn't matter what he believed. He said Elias had spreadsheets. Elias had shown them logs of cash withdrawals matching the exact amounts I had supposedly used to buy a vintage Mustang I was restoring in my shop. I leaned forward. I told Isaac about the stamped checks. I told him about Elias's tax liens. Isaac shook his head, looking almost pitying. He said Elias had an answer for that. Elias had told the family that he had tried to step in and manage Eleanor's finances because he caught me stealing a year ago. Elias claimed he set up a new account to protect her money from me, but that I had somehow forged her signature to access it anyway. Elias had an explanation for everything. He always did. I realized then that arguing with Elias in front of the family would be a slaughter. He was polished, he was respected, and he had spent a year laying the groundwork for this lie. I didn't need to convince my aunts and cousins. I needed to trap Elias in a mechanism he couldn't charm his way out of. I asked Isaac what was in the envelope. He said it was the waiver Elias wanted me to sign. I pulled the document out. It was a standard release of claims drafted by the family lawyer, a man named Arthur Vance who had played golf with our father. But attached to the back of the waiver was a ledger Elias had compiled, detailing the supposed fraudulent transfers. It was a list of dates, amounts, and transaction IDs. I stared at the ledger. Elias had made a mistake. He was arrogant. He believed I was too intimidated, too ashamed of my past to actually look at the machinery of his lie. He had included the internal routing numbers of the transfers on the ledger to make it look official to the family. I told Isaac I would attend a meeting, but not at Elias's house. I told him to tell Elias and Arthur Vance to meet me at the credit union tomorrow at 3 in the afternoon. If they wanted my signature, it was going to be notarized by a bank official on bank property, where my business accounts were currently held hostage. Isaac looked wary, but he agreed to pass the message along. The next day, I arrived at the credit union 20 minutes early. I wore my work boots and a heavy canvas jacket. I didn't try to dress like a businessman. I wasn't going to play Elias's game of appearances. I sat in the small glass-walled conference room near the back of the branch. At exactly 3 o'clock, Elias walked in. He wore a tailored navy overcoat. He looked rested, entirely unbothered. Arthur Vance walked in behind him carrying a leather briefcase. Isaac trailed them, standing near the door, arms crossed. Elias sat across from me. He gave me a look of profound, practiced disappointment. He said he was sorry it had come to this, that he had tried to protect me, but that stealing from our grandmother was a line even he couldn't ignore. He spoke with the cadence of a man who had rehearsed his lines in front of a mirror. Arthur Vance pulled the waiver from his briefcase and placed a heavy silver pen on top of it. He told me that this was a generous offer. He said a fraud conviction would ruin my business and send me to prison, considering my past record. I didn't touch the pen. I looked at Elias. I asked him if he was absolutely certain about the ledger he had provided. I asked if every withdrawal listed was cash that I had supposedly taken. Elias didn't hesitate. He said yes. He said it was a tragedy, but the numbers didn't lie. I nodded. I stood up, opened the conference room door, and signaled to Rebecca, who was waiting at her desk. She walked into the room carrying a thin grey folder. Elias frowned. He asked what the branch manager was doing here. I told Elias that since my business accounts were frozen based on his affidavit, and since I was being asked to sign away property to satisfy a bank-documented debt, I had asked Rebecca to serve as the notary and to verify the clearinghouse data on the waiver. Arthur Vance shifted in his chair. He said that wasn't necessary, that private family mediation didn't require an audit. But Rebecca was already sitting down. She opened her folder. I pushed Elias's ledger toward her. I asked Rebecca to look at the transaction IDs that Elias claimed were my cash withdrawals. Rebecca looked at the paper. The room was perfectly silent. The hum of the HVAC unit above us sounded like an airplane engine. Elias's posture began to rigidify. He subtly reached out, trying to pull the ledger back, but I kept my hand firmly planted on the edge of the paper. Rebecca adjusted her glasses. She looked from the paper to Elias. She didn't speak to me. She spoke directly to Arthur Vance, acting in her capacity as a fiduciary officer. She stated that the ledger presented a fundamental banking impossibility. Elias sharply interrupted, telling her she was violating privacy laws. Rebecca ignored him. She pointed to the routing prefixes on the ledger. She said with absolute bureaucratic calm that the money hadn't been withdrawn in cash by anyone. She explained that the transaction IDs listed on Elias's document were internal SWIFT codes for an automated corporate sweep account. Arthur Vance frowned, leaning over the table. He asked what a sweep account was. Rebecca explained that it was an automated banking function. The funds from Eleanor's savings account hadn't been stolen by a person walking into a branch. They had been systematically drafted at midnight on the 1st of every month to cover the exact overdraft margins of a commercial checking account registered to Davis Logistics. Elias's face lost its color. He stammered, claiming it was a banking error, a misrouting of funds that he was trying to untangle. But Rebecca wasn't finished. She looked down at her folder. She stated that the cross-collateralization agreement authorizing those automatic sweeps had been signed by Elias, using a power of attorney document 3 days before Eleanor was formally diagnosed with vascular dementia. Arthur Vance slowly turned his head to look at Elias. The lawyer wasn't a fool. He realized instantly that he had been used to extort a legal settlement based on fabricated financial documents. Submitting that ledger to a bank official as proof of my debt was dangerously close to wire fraud. Isaac, standing by the door, let out a sharp, breathless laugh. It was a sound of pure disgust. Elias stood up. His chair scraped violently against the carpet. He pointed a finger at me, his voice raising, dropping the polished veneer. He shouted that I didn't understand the pressure he was under, that the logistics company employed 40 people, that the family legacy was going bankrupt while I was playing with rusty cars in a shed. He said he was going to put the money back, that he just needed time, and that I owed him for all the years he kept me out of the gutter. He wasn't denying it anymore. He was justifying it. I didn't yell back. I didn't demand an apology. I just looked at him, seeing the panicked, hollow man beneath the expensive coat. I slid the waiver back across the table. I told Arthur Vance that if the hold on my business account wasn't lifted by close of business today, and if the padlock wasn't removed from my shop within the hour, I wouldn't go to the family. I would go directly to the State Attorney General with the bank's sweep logs. I didn't wait for a response. I stood up, thanked Rebecca for her time, and walked out of the conference room. I didn't stay to watch Elias try to explain himself to the lawyer or to Isaac. The immediate aftermath wasn't explosive drama. It was the quiet, brutal dismantling of my brother's reputation. By the end of the week, the hold on my account was gone. By the end of the month, Arthur Vance had resigned as the estate's attorney, and the probate court had appointed an independent executor to untangle the mess Elias had made of Eleanor's finances. The family didn't suddenly rush to my door to apologize. The reality of what Elias had done was too ugly, too deeply entangled with their own willing blindness for them to face me easily. They had wanted to believe I was the villain because it was comfortable. Realizing that the golden son had systematically drained their inheritance to save his own ego, left them humiliated and fractured. Some of my aunts still don't speak to me, unable to bridge the awkwardness of their own false accusations. I didn't get a massive payout. The money Elias took was gone, swallowed by the creditors of his collapsing company. Davis Logistics filed for bankruptcy 6 months later. Elias moved out of state, leaving a trail of unpaid contractors and broken family ties. But the estate executor formally transferred the deed of the shop to my name, recognizing it as the only solvent asset left that I had a legitimate claim to, unencumbered by Elias's liens. I am in the shop now. It's a Tuesday morning. The old brass padlock is sitting on my workbench, functioning as a heavy, silent paperweight over a stack of new vendor invoices. Outside, the Ohio winter is harsh and grey, but inside, the air compressor is humming, and the smell of hot metal fills the room. I don't have the big family dinners anymore. I don't have the illusion of a perfect brother. But when I close the heavy steel door of the shop at night, I am the only one who holds the key. I thought the brass padlock sitting on my workbench was the end of it. I had assumed that once the bank exposed the automated sweeps, the machinery of my brother's deception would simply grind to a halt, and the family would slowly accept the ugly truth. I was wrong. The bankruptcy of Davis Logistics and Elias's sudden move out of state hadn't been a retreat. It had been a tactical repositioning. He was bleeding, but he wasn't dead, and a desperate man with a bruised ego is far more dangerous than a comfortable one. The illusion of peace lasted exactly 4 months. It shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when a man in a generic grey windbreaker walked into my shop, bypassed the counter, and dropped a heavy tape-sealed envelope onto the hood of a 1968 Chevelle I was sanding. It was a civil summons. Elias was formally contesting the estate's resolution in county court. But he wasn't acting alone. He had managed to convince our 2 aunts, Beatrice and Clara, to join him as co-plaintiffs against both me and the court-appointed executor. I read the filing under the harsh fluorescent lights of my garage. Elias's new narrative was a masterpiece of revisionist history. He wasn't denying that the money had moved from Eleanor's account to his company's ledger. Instead, he was claiming that the transfers were an explicit authorized corporate loan, directed by Eleanor herself to save the family business. To back this up, Elias had produced a new piece of evidence, a handwritten codicil to Eleanor's will, allegedly discovered in a forgotten safe deposit box in Columbus. The codicil explicitly forgave any outstanding debts owed by Davis Logistics to the estate and directed that the commercial property my shop sat on be liquidated to replenish the inheritances of Beatrice and Clara. The lawsuit claimed that my current ownership of the land was the result of me exerting undue influence over a vulnerable woman in her final years, manipulating the independent executor, and colluding with the local credit union manager to frame Elias. Elias didn't use Arthur Vance this time. He had hired a massive litigation firm out of Cleveland. Their strategy was glaringly obvious: bury me in legal fees. They knew my margins were razor thin. They knew I couldn't afford to pay a corporate hourly rate to defend a plot of land that was already technically mine. They wanted to starve me out, force a settlement, sell the land, pay off the aunts to buy their loyalty, and leave Elias looking like the misunderstood savior of the family legacy. Isaac came by the shop the following evening. He brought a six-pack of cheap beer, a peace offering from the only relative who still returned my calls. He looked exhausted, his work boots leaving trails of dust on my concrete floor. He told me the family was entirely fractured. Beatrice and Clara were holding on to Elias's story like a life raft because it was the only scenario where they got their money back. Accepting that Elias had stolen it meant accepting it was gone forever. Blaming me meant there was a piece of real estate they could sell. He's telling them you intimidated Eleanor into giving you the deed, Isaac said, peeling the label off his bottle. He's saying the banking sweeps were set up by her, that she wanted to be a silent partner in the logistics company, and that you manipulated the dates after her dementia diagnosis. I scoffed, tossing a greasy rag onto the workbench. The bank has the power of attorney documents, Isaac. He signed for those sweeps. And his new lawyers are claiming the POA was a standard business precaution that Eleanor insisted on, Isaac replied, his voice heavy. Marcus, they don't have to prove you did it. They just have to drag this through discovery for 2 years until you run out of money and default on your own legal fees. He's going to bleed you dry. I knew he was right. I needed representation, but I couldn't afford a Cleveland shark. I found a local probate litigator named Sarah Jenkins. Her office was in a strip mall next to a dry cleaner, but she had a reputation for being entirely devoid of humor and fiercely competent. I brought her the summons, the codicil copy, and my meager financial records. Sarah reviewed the handwritten codicil in silence. She traced the loops of Eleanor's signature with the back of her pen. The signature looks genuine, Sarah admitted, adjusting her reading glasses. But the phrasing is highly specialized. Indemnification of corporate liabilities, liquidation of real assets. Your grandmother was a retired school teacher. Did she talk like a corporate liquidator? She called the internet the computer network, I replied flatly. She didn't know what indemnification meant. Then Elias drafted it and had her sign it, Sarah concluded, dropping the paper on her desk. The date on this is the problem. It's dated exactly 6 weeks before her formal medical diagnosis of vascular dementia. Legally, she was still of sound mind. To invalidate this, we don't just have to prove Elias is a liar. We have to prove she lacked testamentary capacity on the specific day this was signed, or that she was under active duress. Sarah warned me that a handwriting expert and a retrospective medical evaluation would cost upwards of $10,000, money I simply didn't have. If I couldn't find a way to undermine the codicil's timeline or origin, the judge might grant an injunction, freezing my business operations and padlocking my doors all over again. I left Sarah's office with a cold knot in my stomach. I drove out to Eleanor's old house. It was still tied up in the broader probate dispute, sitting empty at the end of a cul-de-sac. The lawn was overgrown and the porch light was dead. As the executor had given me a key to check the pipes during the winter, I let myself in. The house smelled of stale dust and old floral perfume. The family had already cleared out the valuables, the silver, the antique clocks, the good furniture. What remained were the remnants of a long life. Boxes of old paperbacks, mismatched kitchenware, and stacks of utility bills. I didn't know what I was looking for. A diary, a hidden letter. It felt like a desperate, impossible grasp at straws. I spent 4 hours tearing through the remaining boxes in the attic. Nothing. Just old tax returns from the 1990s and faded holiday decorations. Defeated, I went down to the kitchen to get a glass of water from the tap. I leaned against the faded yellow linoleum counter, staring at the empty space where the heavy oak dining table used to sit. That was where Eleanor used to write her physical checks. That was where she kept her life organized. I looked at the wall calendar still hanging by the refrigerator. It was 3 years old, frozen on the month she had been moved to the assisted living facility. Every square was filled with her cramped, precise handwriting, doctor's appointments, birthdays, reminders to call the plumber. I walked over and flipped the calendar back to the year the codicil was supposedly signed. I found the exact month. I traced my finger down to the date written on Elias's document. October 14th. The square for October 14th wasn't empty. Eleanor had written in thick blue ink, Elias visited, brought new business papers, very angry, refused to sign. I stared at the ink. It was a direct contradiction recorded in her own hand. On the exact day Elias claimed she had willingly signed away her assets. But a note on a calendar wouldn't be enough to hold up in court against a formally witnessed legal document. I needed to know what happened after she refused. I looked at the subsequent days. October 15th. Dr. Evans, memory test. Elias drove me. October 18th. Can't find checkbook. October 22nd. Elias brought papers again. So tired. Just want him to stop shouting. My blood ran cold. The narrative was right there on the wall, but there was something else. A small strange notation on October 24th, just days before the automated sweeps began at the credit union. It simply read, "Gave blue ledger to Arthur." Arthur. Arthur Vance, the family lawyer who had drafted the original settlement waiver for Elias. The man who had sat in the credit union conference room and watched his own reputation nearly go up in flames when the branch manager exposed the bank fraud. Arthur had resigned from the estate, washed his hands of the family and vanished from the narrative. But if Eleanor had given him something, a blue ledger, right as Elias was initiating his hostile takeover of her finances, Arthur might possess the only contemporaneous proof of her state of mind and Elias's coercion. The problem was that Arthur Vance was a creature of self-preservation. He had fled the initial conflict to protect his law license. He wouldn't willingly step back into the crossfire of a messy family lawsuit unless he had no other choice. I couldn't just ask him for it. I had to corner him, exactly the way Elias was trying to corner me. I didn't drive to Arthur Vance's office to demand answers. I knew better than to corner a panicked lawyer without leverage. Instead, I took a photograph of the calendar, printed it out, and brought it directly to Sarah Jenkins. Sarah looked at the printed photograph for a long time. She didn't smile, but a sharp, dangerous focus settled into her eyes. She explained that attorney-client privilege technically survives the death of the client, meaning Arthur couldn't voluntarily hand over Eleanor's private documents, even if he wanted to. But there was a workaround, the crime-fraud exception. If a lawyer's services were used to further a crime or a fraud, the privilege dissolved. Sarah drafted a highly specific subpoena ducis tecum, demanding the surrender of the blue ledger. But she didn't just send it to Arthur's office. She attached a draft of a formal grievance to the State Disciplinary Board, outlining Arthur's presence at the credit union when Elias attempted to use fabricated banking logs to extort my property. The message was entirely unspoken but brilliantly clear. Hand over the ledger as a neutral custodian of the estate, or we will legally name you as a co-conspirator in Elias's fraud. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. 3 days later, a courier dropped a heavy sealed evidence bag on Sarah's desk. Inside was a worn navy blue fabric accounting ledger. We opened it together in her office. I realized immediately where I had inherited my obsessive need for record-keeping. Eleanor hadn't just used the ledger to balance her checkbook. She had used it to document her deteriorating circumstances as Elias's demands escalated. It was filled with dated entries, tracking every time Elias asked for money, every time he raised his voice, and every time he brought documents she didn't understand. But the final entry, dated October 24th, was the linchpin. Eleanor had taped a folded piece of paper to the back cover. It was a photocopy of the exact signature page Elias was now using as the newly discovered codicil, but it wasn't attached to a document liquidating my shop. According to Eleanor's meticulous notes, Elias had forced her to sign a specialized indemnity release for a failed real estate investment his logistics company had made years prior, claiming it was the only way to keep her from being personally sued. She had demanded a photocopy of the signature page for her own records before handing it back to him. Elias hadn't found a lost codicil. He had taken the signature page from that obscure corporate release, detached it, and simply stapled it to a newly drafted forged document that stripped me of my property. That explained the bizarre, highly technical legal jargon Sarah had noticed. The language belonged to a corporate liability waiver, not a grandmother's will. We didn't go to the police. Sarah told me that civil courts move faster than criminal prosecutors, and our immediate goal was to break the lawsuit, aiming to seize my land. She scheduled a deposition at her office. Elias arrived in a charcoal suit, flanked by 2 attorneys from the Cleveland firm. They looked around Sarah's cramped strip mall office with thinly veiled amusement. Elias wouldn't look at me. He sat perfectly straight, radiating the quiet martyrdom of a man who believed his own lies. The lead Cleveland attorney opened his briefcase and began a condescending speech about how my refusal to settle was only depleting the estate further. He suggested a timeline for me to vacate the commercial property. Sarah let him talk for 3 uninterrupted minutes. Then she reached into her drawer and pulled out the evidence bag. She didn't shout. She didn't make a grand, theatrical accusation. She simply slid a high-resolution color copy of Eleanor's final ledger entry across the table. She pointed to the photocopy of the signature page, then laid the plaintiff's exhibit of the supposed codicil right next to it. "Notice the staple marks," Sarah said, her voice dry and mechanical. "The signature page on your codicil has 3 sets of staple holes in the top left corner. The preceding pages only have 1. That signature page was detached from the corporate indemnity waiver my client's grandmother photocopied on October 24th. We have the original ledger ready for forensic ink and paper aging." The room went entirely still. The hum of the cheap fluorescent lights seemed to echo against the drywall. The Cleveland attorney stared at the 2 documents. His amusement vanished, replaced by a rigid, cold professionalism. He understood instantly what he was looking at. He wasn't looking at a family dispute anymore. He was looking at a fabricated document that his firm had formally entered into a county court record. He was looking at a potential disbarment. Elias shifted in his chair. He opened his mouth, the smooth baritone of his voice catching in his throat. That's a forgery. Marcus wrote that. He's trying to—" "Stop talking," the Cleveland lawyer snapped. He didn't look at Elias. He looked at Sarah. He asked very quietly if she had filed this with the county prosecutor yet. Sarah said she was waiting to conclude this deposition before making her next filing. The Cleveland lawyer stood up, snapped his briefcase shut, and looked at his co-counsel. "This deposition is suspended. We are taking a recess." He turned to Elias. "Do not say another word. Step outside, now." They didn't come back into the room. 10 minutes later, Sarah received an email notification on her laptop. The Cleveland firm had formally filed an emergency motion to withdraw as Elias's counsel, citing irreconcilable ethical conflicts. By the end of the afternoon, the civil suit against me was voluntarily dismissed with prejudice. Elias's collapse was total, but it happened entirely in the shadows. Without lawyers to protect him, and terrified of Sarah taking the forged document to the district attorney, he surrendered his position entirely. He signed a legally binding agreement, waiving any and all future claims to Eleanor's estate, admitting no fault on paper, but fleeing the jurisdiction to avoid the criminal exposure. Aunts Beatrice and Clara never apologized. When the dust settled and they realized the money was truly gone, swallowed by Elias's bankruptcy and his desperate legal maneuvers, they simply stopped calling. The silence they had weaponized against me at the beginning became a permanent fixture. I didn't mind. The toxicity had finally burned itself out, leaving nothing but quiet. 2 months later, the independent executor finalized the estate. There was almost no liquid cash left, but the title to the 6 acres of commercial property was transferred to my LLC, free and clear of any encumbrances. It is late Friday evening now. The shop is empty. The heavy roll-up doors are shut against the damp night air. I'm sitting at my workbench, the single overhead lamp casting a circle of light over a fresh stack of invoices and steel orders. Next to the invoices is my own ledger. It is a simple black book where I track every dollar, every hour of labor, every part ordered. I open it, pick up my pen, and write down the final balance of the week in neat, precise numbers. I close the book, turn off the lamp, and listen to the rain hitting the corrugated steel roof of the building that I finally own.